Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Rozier. I'm the director of the Albert Lapage Center for History in the Public Interest and a member of the Villanova History Department faculty. Welcome to the Lapage Center's first event of our fall semester programming. A special welcome to our distinguished panelists, Dr. Chen, Dr. Lugli, and Dr. Schwartz, and tonight's moderator, Dr. Tim McCall. Before we begin, I first want to acknowledge the vision and support of Albert Lapage, whose generosity allowed us to establish the Lapage Center in 2017. And I want to thank Kevin Fox and Alvin Wong for helping to organize tonight's event. Finally, I want to encourage you to attend the Lapage Center's upcoming events. On Wednesday, the 20th, for the first lunch at Lapage of the year, Dr. Eliza Gettle of Villanova's History Department will discuss her research on Greek federalism in the Roman Empire. We'll gather in the Lapage Center on the fourth floor of St. Augustine Center from 12 to 1. On Wednesday, September 27th, we are airing the first of 6 virtual events on the theme of cities in historical perspective. 3 scholars will address the intersection of race and class in post-war American cities. The panelists include Dr. Monika Dirksen, a graduate of Villanova's History MA program. And on Thursday, October 5th, speakers from the University of Pennsylvania, PEN America, and the New York Times will be gathering virtually to examine curriculum and classroom censorship in historical perspective. The 2 virtual events begin at 6 p.m. and require advanced registration. To register, please visit the Lapage Center homepage. And now I have the pleasure of introducing my colleague, Dr. Tim McCall, who will introduce our panelists and then moderate the discussion that will follow their presentations. Please pose questions to our panelists at any point via the Q&A function. Dr. McCall is professor of art history and director of the art history program at Villanova. In addition to histories of fashion and material culture, his research centers on Italian Renaissance courts and on visual intersections of power and gender, particularly masculinity. His scholarship includes the 2013 co-edited volume, Visual Cultures of Secrecy in Early Modern Europe, and the 2022 monograph, Brilliant Bodies, Fashioning Courtly Men in Early Renaissance Italy, published by Penn State University Press. His forthcoming work includes Making the Renaissance Man, Masculinities in the Courts of Renaissance Italy, to be published by Reaction Books this fall, and a roundtable discussion on Fashion Before Fashion, Le Mode Avant Le Mode in the French journal Perspective. Dr. McCall is also co-writing a monograph for Cambridge University Press entitled Vibrant Banners, the Material Culture of Battle Standards in Renaissance Europe, and co-editing the 6th volume, Cultural History of Luxury for Bloomsbury Press. Dr. McCall.
Thank you very much, Paul. And I want to thank also Kevin and Alvin for helping to organize this. I'm very excited, but I really want to, I'm most excited to welcome our 3 speakers. And so that everyone knows how we're going to proceed, I'm going to introduce all 3 speakers in the order in which they will speak. And then everyone will have 12 or so minutes, give or take, to present why fashion matters in history and why history matters for fashion, according to how they see it, according to their research. And then we'll have a little time for discussion, and then time for your questions too. And we'll finish up probably somewhere between 7:15 and 7:30. So please do ask questions. This is a lot about, the discussion is important here. And I know it's going to be a very fruitful one based on these three sisters. The first of whom is Dr. BuYun Chen, Associate Professor of History at Swarthmore College. Dr. Chen has published articles in journals such as Technology and Culture and ISIS, in chapters in recent edited volumes, including The Cambridge Global History of Fashion and The Right to Dress, Sumptuary Laws in a Global Perspective. Most importantly, and I brought a book from everyone just to show it off so you can see what we're talking about here. Dr. Chen is the author of Empire of Style, Silk and Fashion in Tong China, published in 2019 by the University of Washington Press. And her current research examines relationships between ecological change, craft technology, and court-controlled resource management in the Ryukyu Kingdom from the 17th to the 19th centuries. Our second speaker will be Dr. Emanuele Lugli, Assistant Professor of Art History at Stanford University, a special in Italian art, architecture, and fashion. He's authored, I should say, a trilogy of books on the history of measurement, an Italian, one on the history, essentially, of the meter, Unità di misura, also the making of measure and the promise of sameness, and measuring in the Renaissance, an introduction, which is just out. And also out this year with University of Chicago Press is this awesome book, Knots, or the Violence of Desire in Renaissance Florence, on the role of hair in creating notions of beauty and desire. And beyond academia, Emanuele has contributed to The Garden, Slate, Vogue, Vanity Fair. I personally would recommend his recent Vanity Fair essay on the second season of The White Lotus. Our third speaker, Dr. Alexandra Schwartz, has a Ph.D. in art history from the University of Michigan and is a curator in modern and contemporary art, craft, and design at the Museum of Arts and Design in New York, MAD. Dr. Schwartz is also adjunct professor at SUNY Fashion Institute of Technology. She has many exhibitions, which include most recently garmenting, and I brought that catalog, costume as contemporary art at MAD last year, 52 Artists, a feminist milestone at the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum, at the Clark Art Institute, an exhibition of Helen Frankenthaler's paintings, and Come As You Are, Art of the 1990s, that's a Nirvana lyric, right, which toured a number of venues and was, I think, the first retrospective exhibition of 90s art. I cannot neglect to mention that now through March, Alex's exhibition on Taylor Swift's clothing and costumes, Taylor Swift's Storyteller, is at MAD, at the Museum of Arts and Design. And she has some super exciting forthcoming exhibitions engaging fashion in the works. So those are our three speakers. And I'll first turn it over to Dr. BuYun Chen. The floor is yours. I'm going to mute myself. Do everyone.
Hi, I would like to begin by thanking the Lapage Center for the invitation to participate in this evening's roundtable, in particular, Dr. McCall and Kevin Fox for making the arrangements. So what I would like to do in my allotted time is to illustrate how the claim to fashion, who has or does not have it, has been intimately linked to claims about historical change itself. And to start, I would like for us to take a close look at an article published earlier this week in the New York Times. Some of you may have already read it. It's titled, "China May Ban Clothes That Hurt People's Feelings. People Are Outraged." So under discussion is a proposal to fine or detain individuals, quote, wearing clothing or bearing symbols in public that are detrimental to the spirit of the Chinese people and hurt the feelings of the Chinese people. If the proposed amendments are approved, such incidents could result in fines of up to $680 or up to 15 days in police custody. Not surprisingly, the proposed ban has sparked significant outrage. So, for example, and this is my favorite response in the kind of social media discourse, one user on the social media platform Weibo posted, quote, "Will wearing a suit and tie count? Marxism originated in the West. Would its presence in China also count as hurting national feelings?" End quote. But what is most striking to me in this article is not the ban itself, but how the journalist has narrated the recent history of dress and fashion in the People's Republic. So this is another section that I would like for us to look a little closely at. Fashion here is emphasized as not only the force of economic change, but also social and political change. So, quote, "The contrast between the models in haute couture and the audiences wearing mostly dark-colored mousesuits reflected a jarring gap," end quote. Right, so according to the journalist, this fundamental gap was one between an affluent, vibrant, developed world and then an impoverished, oppressive China. And so she concludes, China had to change. First, it had to allow people to wear what they liked. By changing their clothes, China entered a new stage of development, a new stage of history, perhaps. And the implication, of course, is that what they liked was the Western fashion representative of affluent, vibrant, developed worlds. The conflation of what people wear and the nation state in this article underscores how matters of appearance are always political, and perhaps explains why states, not just China, are so invested in how their citizens dress. This insight is by no means new. In fact, the claim that fashion, which we typically understand as the phenomenon of changing clothes, was indicative of deeper social and political change, is one that extends far back in time. And the comparison between the fashionable West and traditional China, likewise, is a long-standing one, stretching from the 18th century until, well, now. The belief that China lacked anything that could be considered fashion was part and parcel of a myth that only the West had fashion. And for many writers of the past couple of centuries, the connection between a fickle society and a modern one was inextricable, meaning that a desire to change one's clothes was evidence of a propensity for change on a broader scale. So a stable society was unlikely to change its clothes. And such was the state of China and generally the non-West, in which the rule of changelessness governed. The shocking discovery that fashion existed in China became a trope in American popular print media in the 20th century, notably in Vogue magazine. And although Vogue promoted and appropriated Chinese dress styles and aesthetics, as well as other visual and material cultures in its cover designs, features, and spreads, the editors continued to publish conflicting accounts of the state of fashion in China. So I'm going to show a couple of these articles published a year apart. The first one is an article from 1924 titled "The Celestial at Home." Betty Thornley, who wrote this piece, is told by her guest from Shanghai named Spring Branch that the clothes she brought to wear in New York would be perceived as old-fashioned back home in Shanghai. Thornley, in turn, was surprised to learn that, quote, Chinese women had them, referring to fashions, end quote, as she believed that theirs, quote, was an unchanging mode, end quote. Over a year later, in 1925, a feature article titled "The Ancestor Worshipping Mode of China," the anonymous author or authors explored Chinese dress in greater depth, relating the conservatism of Chinese dress to the despotism of its rulers. The Chinese woman of fashion is described as painstakingly particular and carefully precise about details that vary tyrannically from season to season, demonstrating how well Oriental despotism explains changing fashions as it does unchanging fashions. Euro-American scholars echoed the judgments of Vogue contributors. One French scholar has even argued that fashion is, quote, an exceptional process inseparable from the origin and development of the modern West, end quote. So locating fashion in time and space has thus long been a Eurocentric endeavor, one that depended upon the conflation of modernity with European progress. And such views, indeed, the Western gaze itself, were adopted by many early 20th century Chinese intellectuals who, in upholding the West as a benchmark, participated in local and global discourses on dress as a measure of civilizational change. In recent decades, the claim that fashion is a distinctly European phenomenon has been challenged by historians and fashion studies scholars alike. So I'm going to give a kind of broad overview of the interventions made within fashion history and fashion studies of the past few decades. The more dominant view shared by current scholars is that fashion, broadly defined as a social phenomenon underpinned by material change, can be found in all parts of the world and across history. Dress and bodily practices have been critical to how societies perceived self and other in and beyond Europe. Desire to change one's clothes was not symptomatic of an inclination towards change and novelty that was peculiar to European societies, and instead a condition shaped by myriad social, cultural, and material forces. So one of the arguments is that perception of change and its representation, like the phenomenon of fashion itself, is also a historically conditioned and culturally embedded practice. To allow for fashion to exist in multiple places and time periods, scholars have worked then to overturn the simple equation of fashion with modernity. Returning to the root sense of the term, historical studies of dress have focused attention on fashion as a process of fluid self-fashioning within dynamic social worlds. Textile histories have demonstrated how the circulation of both raw materials and finished goods shaped local and global desires, revealing the historical entanglements that fostered economic, technological, and cultural change, a point that I will return to at the end. So in short, the more recent scholarship on fashion has made explicit the methodological position that fashion must be interrogated within their historical context. And to interrogate fashion as historical is to dispense with the longstanding Eurocentric assumptions, including notions of a universal model of fashion and an all-encompassing fashion theory derived from Euro-American experiences. To be attentive to historical specificity would in turn entail challenging the approaches that have been foundational to fashion studies, such as questioning the relevance of a national historical framework and moving beyond a stadial or teleological conception of history. But fashion histories remain bound by national, for example, Chinese fashion, continental, for example, African, or binary units, Western and non-Western. The nation-state model of history binds fashion to political chronology, subsuming changes and continuities in dress practices and its broader implications under a single narrative arc. In the case of Chinese studies, 20th century scholars depicted sartorial change as coextensive with political change, the same view taken up by the New York Times journalist. The dilemma, as I see it, is as follows. If we accept fashion to be historically conditioned, its emergence and maintenance contingent, and its features distinctive according to time and place, then can we speak of a monolithic Chinese fashion or Western fashion? And to illustrate this point, I will move from discourse to things to argue that a historical approach to fashion must also take the material stuff of fashion seriously. So the longstanding focus on silhouette and shape in fashion studies had eclipsed the importance of the global textile trade that made an expanding selection of silk and cotton textiles from Asia available to consumers worldwide, fixing the locus of fashionable change to the tailoring of garments rather than the materials of dress. Over the past few decades, scholarship on 18th century trade has shown that multiple circuits of exchange linked local visual and material culture to trans-regional and global aesthetic practices that informed individual self-fashioning and knowledge-making. So I'll show just two examples. The first is the BuYun. The popularity of this men's garment, and the BuYun is a term that was of a Anglo-Indian coinage used to refer to loose robes based on a Japanese garment known as the kasode. The popularity of this garment among 18th century men in Europe and America is a prime example of how dress styles and language also traveled alongside textiles to be adapted and adopted, thereby shaping practices of self-presentation and contributing to a global lexicon. I would emphasize here that that colonialism was critical to the formation of global fashion practices. Displays of cosmopolitanism should not obscure the relations of power that made them both possible and desirable. Another example are how painted and printed cottons from the Coromandel coast of the Indian subcontinent were also traded further east to Tokugawa, Japan. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, these textiles known as sarasa became popular materials for inner robes, obis, and other accessories. Publishers even printed compendia of sarasa patterns, as you see here. So what these objects show is how weaving, dyeing, and patterning practices, as well as finished textiles, connected communities of makers and wearers across long distances, calling into question our modernist, nation-centered perspectives on fashion's past. So to quickly conclude, I would just say that by following the material practices that have been fundamental to the perception of change, and in turn, our ability to kind of identify fashion historically, we may continue to interrogate the relationship between matters of appearance and social status, gender relations, historical consciousness, structures of production, and dynamics of consumption without the a priori assumptions that have privileged the West as a universal model. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. That was great. Dr. Lugli, you're next.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Let me just share the screen. All right. So I also would like to join Dr. Chen in thanking the Lapage Center for this invitation, and to Professor Rosier and McCall for organizing the event, as well as for the introductions. So 15 years ago, while living in England, I needed money. I was working as a journalist for Vogue Italia, but the stipend was insufficient. I was being paid per article, and each time it was a ridiculously small amount. I then followed a friend's advice and decided to apply for a teaching position at a fashion school that was called Istituto Marangoni. Istituto Marangoni was a prestigious technical school in Milan, founded in the 1930s, primarily to train pattern makers to support the growing textile industry in the north of Italy. Only later, around the 1970s, did it expand to include marketers and product managers to cater to the new roles of the new fashion industry. In the early 2000s, it underwent a change in ownership and decided to transform into a swanky design school with centers all around the world. And London was the first branch of many. And London was the city where I was living. So I met the director when her office still smelled of wet paint. And she told me that because of my background in journalism, I was supposed to teach two types of classes: analysis of the latest catwalks and sociology of fashion. Basically, I taught future fashion designers how to analyze garments, where the inspirations behind them likely came from, and what forces were at play in the design industry. I brought in many designers, and many of my students ended up working in design teams for major brands such as Alexandra McQueen and Burberry. And over the years, when I invited the students back to share their experience in the fashion world with a new group of students, I asked them about the relationship to history. And they all answered the same way. As designers, they spend the vast majority of their time in vintage shops. Each brand they were working for, so the employer, gave them a budget, and they spent it buying everything they found interesting, like 1970s leather boots, African textiles, military coats. Those purchases then served as prototypes for pieces in their upcoming collections. When my former students didn't spend time in vintage shops, they told me they went to libraries, looking at old photographs, or traveling to museums in search of inspiration. They spent a lot of time discussing the latest fashion trends as they saw them all around them. They talked about why some pieces were gaining popularity, what celebrities are the best stylists, and why. The fashion industry is a big cloud of opinions, and to make it in fashion, you need to have many pairs of ears to understand what opinions are gaining popularity and which are fizzling away. Still, when it got to design, my former students kept returning to books, vintage collections, and museum galleries. This approach was then validated by top designers. John Galliano, who was then the head of Christian Dior while I was teaching in London, today he is the creative director of Margiela, put forward couture collections after couture collection based on a theme, or better, a culture. For instance, for spring 2004, he decided that such a theme was to be ancient Egypt, after he took a hot air balloon trip to the Valley of the Nile. The result is what you see on screen. Skirts flaring out of bejeweled corsets, hand-painted with hieroglyphic patterns and lotus flowers. Some models sported the heads of sphinxes and Set, the protector of the dead. This show, attended by the likes of Sarah Jessica Parker, who was then in Paris to film the final episodes of Sex and the City, drew rounds of applause. The press unanimously praised it as a monumental, lavish, wildly creative, and ironic. After all, the model strolled to the notes of the Bangles' 1980s hit, Walk Like an Egyptian. Today, most people will say it differently, as an example of the free pass the many designers gave themselves when mixing patterns and motifs from different cultures and periods. The brand Dior, back then, was considered synonymous with opulence. Dresses had to be made of yards and yards of fabric, which had to detach from the body and produce gravity-defying forms. This was a haute couture show, after all, and it took place in Paris' Stock Exchange. I stress the shift of opinions because history is not a reservoir of forms and colors and slogans, but is a discipline that asks you to reflect on new relationship with the past. When you look at Galliano's Spring 2004 couture collection, it is evident that from his hot air balloon trip, he developed a rather superficial idea of what ancient Egypt was. Ancient Egypt, after all, was not just pharaohs, mummies, and deities frozen in profile. It was not just about gold mirrored surfaces. Even the most cursory online research will tell you that ancient Egypt has one of the world's richest textile traditions, for instance. The earliest woven garments in the world, a tunic dated to around 500 BCE, is Egyptian. It's in the Petrie Museum in London, here on the left. Egypt perfected cloth printing. We have ancient Roman historians who marveled at what they took to be an incredible innovation and clothed themselves in fabrics decorated with thin lines and small floral motifs, not the giant loud patterns of Galliano. So, knowing even just this tiny bit of history prompts the questions of why Galliano decided to focus on the most stereotypical aspects of Egypt. Who was appealing to by doing so? These questions are not just useful to marketing directors. They also tell you what kind of idea of fashion Galliano developed. Fashion designers must inevitably cultivate an appreciation of the past. However, the way they select historical objects and how they integrate them in their designs informs us about the nature of fashion these designs ultimately embody. I'm not sure that a deeper historical study of ancient Egypt may have prompted Galliano to produce better fashion, but it would certainly have made him develop a better, more interesting relationship to the past. You see, I want to play the devil's advocate today and tell you that I think the relationship of fashion and history is very complicated. It is not just a matter of one being in need of the other. As much as fashion depends on history as a source of inspiration, as a mirror that shows back to designers what type of video fashion they are developing, fashion also worships forgetfulness. After speaking to people in the fashion industry, I sometimes wonder if every designer would like the whole world to have their memory erased so they could be free to produce anything they like. Sometimes this achievement is indeed achieved because people do forget a great deal and rather quickly. Consider another moment from the history of the house of Christian Dior, its very beginning, actually. Christian Dior was launched with a presentations on February 12, 1947, almost 3 years after the liberations of France, at the end of Second World War. And in France, Second World War concluded on August 25th, 1944. Dior's first collection was considered so original to be called the New Look, even if the New Look was basically a revival of petticoat skirts paired with tightly corseted waists. The expression is credited to Caramel Snow, then editor of Harper's Bazaar, and the view was shared by many, including Dior himself, who 10 years later wrote in his autobiography that his clothes were supposed to be seen, I quote, like flowers springing through the ruins of World War II, unquote. He was being truthful. He did see clothes like flowers. He even called one of his first silhouettes, the one you see on the screen, Corolle, which in botany is the collection of the petals around a pistil. Titled Christian Dior and I, Dior's autobiography starts with an obsession with war. He presents war as a list of material issues, I quote, damaged buildings, devastated countrysides, rationing, the black market, and the serious but of more interest to me, hideous fashion, end quote. And he did so to explain his success in terms of opulence. Like the journalists who supported him, Dior believed that he had given women what the war robbed them of, lavish clothes made of yards and yards of fabric sculpted around a new, sophisticated silhouette. The issue? Dior's dresses were nothing new. Pinched waists and pronounced hips have been proposed in Paris by many designers just before the war. Just Google Balenciaga's Infanta collections of 1939 and see. You have a picture here on the left. Elsa Schiaparelli, another important Parisian designer, had also proposed long full skirts under tiny bodices in 1938. Dior simply resumed what the war halted. Yet, asking whether Dior was continuing, reviving, copying, or innovating is, in my opinion, missing the point, since, as Roland Barthes has argued, fashion is a nominalist discipline. And what I mean by that is it means that it does not matter if clothes are not new or not. It only matters that they're called that way, which is another way to say that the only thing that matters is the fable the people build around them, which is the reason why marketing is so important in fashion, as a way to construct emotions around clothes. But we know that history is a powerful antidote against fables. History can correct desires of forgetfulness in fashion. It limits its nominalistic tendency. It keeps their delusions of cultural appropriations in check. I find the relationship between fashion and history to be complicated, but I'm here today to advocate that we build a stronger connections between the two. Fashion, with its needs for forgetfulness, may stand against some aspects of history, but history undeniably helps fashion produce better objects and, more importantly, prompts more quality questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Emanuele. Wow, that was great. I've got a bunch of questions, but Dr. Schwartz, you're up.
Hello. I want to join the other panelists in thanking the Lapage Center and Dr. Rosier and Dr. McCall for inviting me. I decided to address this question of fashion in historical context by looking at the history of fashion within museums. So fashion exhibitions and fashion within museums actually has quite a long history. Clothing has been shown within a museum context for most of the 20th century and certainly into the 21st century. Sorry, I'm having a little problem here. Scrolling between. There we go. So my own personal kind of introduction to the fashion exhibition was at the Smithsonian at the National Museum of American History. And I think that for a lot of people who either visited Washington or grew up in the United States, probably this was a lot of people's introduction to fashion exhibitions. And it's still around to this day. It's been around for decades, but there's this display of the inauguration dresses of the first ladies that is kind of one of the most popular exhibits at the Smithsonian. And it's changed a lot in style over the years. But I think for many people, the idea that these gowns are historical artifacts and help tell American history is very kind of influential in a lot of people's thinking, regardless of their relationship to the field itself. Also at the Smithsonian, one can see what I would argue are examples of fashion in museums, spacesuits. This is part of an exhibit on the US versus the Russian space race, and two spacesuits, one John Glenn and one his Russian counterpart, that are on display. So again, exhibiting clothing, uniforms, spacesuits as an aspect of material culture, I think makes a big impression on many people who go to visit the Smithsonian as part of their kind of tour of Washington. Military uniforms are also very popular as a form of fashion exhibition. This is from a show in Paris a couple of years ago that was dedicated to Napoleon. And it's interesting that they showed uniforms because, of course, one problem inherent to the display of fashion is that textiles tend to disintegrate. And so the examples of historical textiles are few and far between. Really, it doesn't go much farther back than the 18th century most of the time. And kind of as an aside, but I think it's relevant, I always associate that kind of display with historical reenactments, which of course are popular all over the world. This is a Napoleonic one. We have a lot of Civil War and American Revolutionary War ones in this country. But I feel as if in the popular imagination, it's a pretty kind of interestingly intertwined phenomenon of the costume exhibition versus the kind of reenactment by amateurs of battles, as we see pictured here. Other kind of early prototypes of fashion exhibitions were, of course, very closely related to anthropology. This is an installation shot of a show of New Guinea feather headdresses from the Brooklyn Museum in 1985. And of course, there are many issues from today's perspective with this kind of exhibition, ranging from the fact that, and I am speaking here as a curator, you basically can't show feathers in most cases anymore because of fish and wildlife regulations. You have to know exactly where the feathers came from in order for them to be allowed to be shipped. But also, of course, there's an enormous debate and discourse around showing these useful items, ritual items as art, as well as showing them in an anthropological context. But this is an important precedent for a lot of exhibition making about fashion. And then here I show a slide from the exhibition that I would say is still influencing the discourse around fashion within the museum. This was the Giorgio Armani show at the Guggenheim in 2001 that was very highly criticized at the time, both for putting fashion as art in an art museum, but also around issues of sponsorship and where that line between marketing and the funding of exhibitions lies. And this was funded in part by Armani, which was very, very controversial at the time, now seems a lot more commonplace, but an important landmark in that conversation and debate. In recent years, fashion exhibitions have expanded a lot to kind of venture more into not just work done by designers versus work that is shown from an anthropological perspective, but exhibitions such as this, which is on view right now at the Design Museum in London, the Offbeat Sari, looks at a traditional form of dress, the sari, but through the lens not only of its role within codes of dress, but how designers are using it and manipulating it. Also expanding the kind of basic canon of fashion exhibitions. I'm so sorry. I have to get my dog out of here. Hang on one second. Sorry. So this exhibition of Anne Lowe, which is currently at the Winterthur Museum in Delaware, is looking at a previously overlooked fashion designer who was African American and had a practice within kind of very high society in New York and elsewhere. And this is the wedding dress that she made for Jackie Kennedy. Also on right now is a show of costume, fashion, and other projects by Madame Song at the M Plus Museum in Hong Kong. She was what I think might be best described as a kind of impresario working in art, fashion, design. And this is a look at her life through the objects that she collected. So from this kind of general overview, I thought it would be useful to look at a couple of case studies of how different museums have established fashion departments and mounted fashion exhibitions. So the oldest collection is the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And their very first fashion exhibition was in 1913, and it was called English Costume from the collection of Talbot Hughes. And it was all traditional dress, mostly of clothing that was owned by aristocrats, that was shown in what's essentially kind of their lobby liminal spaces. And you can recognize the architecture of the V&A there. Another tack that the V&A took early on was almost as a kind of war effort marketing or war recovery. This was called Britain Can Make It from 1946, and its purpose was to promote British industry and British clothing and to kind of help jumpstart the economy after the war. A Lady of Fashion, Heather Furbank, was a collection of dresses owned by a socialite who compulsively collected clothing. And we see an installation shot of it on the left, and then a selection of those dresses in much more modern photography on the right. We then started to see develop the fashion exhibition as a more kind of personal perspective from the point of view of a curator of what was happening in style and popular culture at a certain moment. So this was Fashion and Anthology by Cecil Beaton, who was very much a fixture in London society, another impresario, you could say, from 1971. And you can see some works by Yves Saint Laurent and others in this kind of very groovy 70s style installation. Jumping forward a little bit, Street Style from Sidewalk to Catwalk from 1994 was really influential in looking at fashion from the perspective of what is being worn out there on the streets. And street style these days, streetwear is very much a part of the fashion vocabulary, but this was kind of pioneering in bringing that into the museum. As a sort of way to think about fashion from a different perspective, more sort of within the realm of art, are exhibitions like Imperial Chinese Robes from the Forbidden City from 2011, which brought many historical robes that were worn by the emperors and other in the imperial courts in China. And then finally, in recent years, the V&A has been very well known for these kind of pop culture extravaganzas, often relating to music, such as David Bowie Is from 2013, later shown at the Brooklyn Museum, that bring together his costumes, video, archival materials in these kind of grand celebrations of pop culture figures. Fashioning Masculinities is one of the more, I would say, kind of critical scholarly shows that the V&A has done in recent years that's looking at the art of menswear from much more of a kind of cultural studies perspective. And then their current show, which is focused on K-pop, which goes back to the model of showing costumes, videos, music, and capturing this pop culture phenomenon. Of course, a huge factor in shows like K-pop and David Bowie is that they do have this popular appeal. They're about popular culture, but they're also intended to bring visitors into the museum who perhaps are K-pop or David Bowie fans, but not necessarily regular patrons of the V&A. And fashion has always been very useful to museums from that perspective. And I think is part of what's driving the popularity of these shows. They are huge moneymakers and museums need that. So it's kind of interesting to think about where looking at fashion as a part of material culture and an indication of what's happening in a particular period intersects with those more quotidian practical considerations of what brings people through the door. The Met's Costume Institute, of course, is the center of probably thinking about fashion from a museum perspective in the US. It's always had a particular style and a particular take on fashion. It was founded by Diana Vreeland, who was another impresario, who was the very well-known editor of Vogue for many years, and then kind of the unofficial curator of the Costume Institute. She's always known as a consultant throughout the 70s and 80s. And this is one of her first shows, Sporting Life. I'm particularly intrigued by the mannequins here, which are very much out of style these days to have the actual features and, expressions painted onto them. This was one of her most controversial exhibitions, the Manchu Dragon, Costumes of the Qing Dynasty. Partly because, as you can see here, she styled them as if they were being shot in a fashion magazine. She mixed up pieces. There was no real regard for historical accuracy. Perhaps most notoriously, she had Yves Saint Laurent's Opium perfume, which it had recently been released, piped into the exhibition so that everything smelled like opium perfume. And of course, it had pretty much nothing to do with actual history or culture relating to China, but was a very Orientalist kind of take and fantasy, as was the whole exhibition. She, not surprisingly, went on to do a retrospective of Yves Saint Laurent, which was the first time the Met had done a show of a living designer, and there she is with Saint Laurent. The Met tried to kind of make up, I think, for the previous exhibition by doing Orientalism, Visions of the East in Western Dress in 1994, which brought the discourse around Orientalism into the Costume Institute in a more overt way. Perhaps their best known exhibition from the early part of the 2000s was Dangerous Liaisons, Fashions and Furniture in the 18th Century, which was really inventive in the way that it had costumes in the period rooms as these kind of tableau or mise en scène, bringing together their decorative arts and their costume collections. Alexandra McQueen, of course, was the biggest blockbuster the Met had at the Costume Institute, and I think only second to Tutankhamun in the 70s. And then a contrast to that, a much more kind of under the radar show was Charles James, which is really admired among fashion historians in particular for looking closely at a designer who's mostly kind of on under the radar in recent years. China Through the Looking Glass, I'd be very interested to hear our other panelists' perspective on this one. a kind of recurring fascination with looking specifically at China, but kind of how Orientalism has played in Western fashion. And then recently, a survey exhibition called In America, a lexicon of fashion, that tried to look at American fashion from a historical and critical perspective. This was the Costume Institute's most recent show, and I bring this in partly because a lot of the same controversies that surfaced with the Armani show over 20 years ago came back with the Lagerfeld show. Lagerfeld, of course, was a giant of French fashion. He worked at Chanel for decades and had a huge influence. He also was a very problematic person in terms of his politics, his statements. And so that show also came under a lot of fire. And then as a contrast to that, I think it's useful to look at the museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology, which sees itself as, I apologize, the combination of my children being home and my dog being home means that things are a little chaotic. The museum at FIT sees itself as a kind of scholarly alternative to the monographic exhibitions that the Met does. They tend to do group shows. They tend to be thesis driven. And part of the reason why they shy away from monographic exhibitions is because they don't have to get into those issues of who's funding it, of whether a fashion house is funding their own exhibition. Their kind of guiding light is Valerie Steele, who in many ways helped create the field of fashion studies and fashion curation. This is one of her early shows, The Corset from 2000. Another Gothic Dark Glamour from 2008 to 2009. And then more recently, they did a very important survey of Black fashion designers from 2016-17. Pink, The History of a Punk Pretty Powerful Color. And Fresh, Fly, and Fabulous, 50 Years of Hip Hop Style from this year. So I think that I don't have a, one answer to how museums display fashion. I think there are a lot of different ways to do it, depending on the museum's objectives, depending on who they're working with, whether it's a major designer who gets you into the marketing realm of things, or whether it's more from a scholarly perspective. But I do think it's interesting that fashion being an integral part of material culture has been alive in the museum, I think, for longer than it has within the academy. And part of that has to do with the popular appeal of fashion and the way that museums are always thinking about that in a slightly different way. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Schwartz. And so I think we can bring everyone back. There's one question. Please ask some questions in the Q&A, and we'll definitely get to Sandra. We'll get to your question. But I might start off our conversation with a very maybe broad or general question for all three of our speakers. What do you think for historians are maybe like the most what are some of the challenges or maybe opportunities that thinking about fashion presents to historians? I mean, we've talked so much about time and change and modernity and forgetfulness. What pitfalls are there? What are some challenges that historians should be careful of or aware of? What are some opportunities that maybe work still left to be done, or just ways to think historically with fashion? Anyone? Yeah.
Sure, maybe I'll start. So for me, it's interesting to see how, for instance, when we talk about history, we mostly talk about academia, right? So we're talking about academic history, and academia has very different goals and drives and reasons that don't seem to be always perfectly aligned with those in the fashion world today, like the contemporary fashion world, but also maybe the fashion world of the past, if we can even spot those goals. But academia does not realize that. I mean, academia always thinks to be this kind of like transparent, or like the museums think to be transparent institutions, right? They try to like pursue the truth and see how things are and so on. But you know, but they're interesting, and they depend on materials that sometimes fashion is not capable of producing. For instance, they want documents that are tangible, that remain the same, and they're unaltered, right? And fashion is the opposite of that. They produce something ephemeral. That they're not all designers are interested in leaving traces behind. You know, they're much more interested in making a client happy, let's say. And I'm just talking about like a very narrow definitions of fashion, because as we've already heard, there are so many. So for me, one of the major clashes is this, right? That we're talking with two different fields, two different machines in a way, and they have different desires and they're different goals, and they don't necessarily like go hand in hand, at least definitely not all the time.
Thank you.
I might add, I think, is that we take for granted that fashion exists, right? Because we're constantly surrounded by changes, I mean, by the contemporary fashion industry. And we forget that fashion kind of really emerged as a specific concept in the 20th century. This is the academic understanding of fashion. And so that concept, once it's been used to kind of think about the past, brings all of the baggage of when it was formulated. And so one of the challenges for historians who don't work on the modern period and don't work on the West is trying to find a way to talk about a desire that is fashion, you know, of self-fashioning, or of wanting to change one's clothes, or even a system of production that is not quite capitalist, but guarantees that, you know, wearers are supplied with changing designs without defaulting to a view of fashion that is fundamentally shaped by a Western conception of it.
I think that something that gets tricky here is that, you know, fashion is one part of studying dress. And I think that the terminology often gets a little bit blurred, but, you know, dress has been around forever and is everywhere. Like, everyone wears clothes. So I think that there are really distinct things to talk about. There's the fashion industry, which is a modern phenomenon. You know, you could date it back various places, but, you know, and I think that in thinking about it more broadly, you also have to think about what's usually thought of as anthropology, that, you know, fashion is a language that has been used forever. So I guess I see it as a little more complicated. And to me, it's sort of indicative of how academic disciplines have been unnecessarily segregated. Like, it's possible to study dress from so many different perspectives.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. Right. And of course, I think, you know, maybe even in the title, people have of this session, people do have various ideas about what fashion is, right? Even just in fashion historians do, right? Are they actually thinking critically about what fashion means in terms of an industry or temporality, or are they just equating it with clothing, right, or material culture in some way? So it is, I think it's important to sort of be aware of the categories you're taking under, that you're assuming that you're using for all of us. Please ask more questions. We have a couple, so I'll go in order, and we have maybe another 15 to 20 minutes or so to discuss things. And you know, maybe some of you all want to ask questions of each other, but let's go with the questions here first. So Sandra Seekins, who, hello, asks, the Manchu Dragon exhibition reminds me of taxidermy exhibits in which animals are falsely made to look fierce. Yeah, it's a tradition, and I think of maybe even sort of like humans, right, in a sort of like made to look like out of time or out of civilization, also in certain natural history museums, maybe as well too. Does that comparison have any validity in terms of histories of museums, I guess, and exhibitions?
Thank you, Sandra. That's a great question. I mean, what I would say is that any display of fashion is constructed. And part of what I was hoping to get at by showing that variety of fashion exhibitions is that there's so many different ways to do it. Diana Vreeland was, I think you could call her an artist in and of herself. And she felt that it was very much her project and she could kind of manipulate the object she was showing as she wished. And it was, not really beholden to convention in quite the same way. So yeah, I suppose you could link it to taxidermy, but any display of fashion, just like any display of any other sort of object, is determined by a set of conventions and style and, what is kind of seen as a standard exhibition practice at the time. But yeah, certainly the degree of artifice that she embraced is very reminiscent of taxidermy and that kind of exhibition.
And Emanuele, did you want to answer that too? I saw. No.
I pressed the wrong button. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. I saw a button saying that you did. That's okay. My pin just exploded, so we're all having some technical issues. And there was also one answered question. Kevin, I wanted to make sure that someone asked if there'd be a recording of the Zoom out on the email list, and it will come out with a monthly newsletter. I wanted to make sure the person who asked that saw that answer. I'm not sure how it works. Our next question, how can fashion help us produce a better history? Are there opportunities for fashion to help us teach history in ways that connect with students in a more interesting way? And I think there is a point where, fashion, but also sort of maybe material culture or dress or clothing. But I want, what would you all say?
If I can start, it's I think we see these already, how all the historians of textiles, dress, and fashion, and so on, they're already working and they've already enriched our historical narratives to a great extent. So I think this is already happening. Now we have programs specifically designed to train people in what I call a fashion or costume history or dress history. And there are journals dedicated to it. There's like general more attentions. And so even our historical narratives are expanding and becoming more, richer by the efforts of all these people. And but I think there's a second part also to these questions, which is the way the fashion is considered to be sort of like immediate, and therefore something that especially young people are immediately drawn to, and connected, and therefore fashion can become a way to make history more palatable, I suppose, more acceptable, and that I'm not sure that fashion is. Especially the fashion of the past is necessarily, say, an easy way, it's more immediate to make history more accessible, say, because in my historical studies of the fashion of the past, you realize actually fashion is very difficult. Use terminology that is not in current use. It requires a huge amount of time to understand how things were made, because we think we have an understanding of it, because fashion is our daily activity, and yet the fashion at the time had different connotations, had different meanings, different points of accessibility. So if anything, one of the things I like about fashion in the past is that it makes the past such as like a different planet. It really shows us the strangeness of the past and how different it is from our times.
I teach a course on fashion theory and history, and without fail, every semester I teach it. Students who sign up for the course always think we're going to just talk about clothes or the Kardashians or both. And then they're very disappointed to discover that there will be clothes, but there will not be Kardashians. And over the course of the semester, what they come to realize, hopefully, is that the study of fashion history is not just the study of clothes, I think, as the others have pointed out, but it's actually a way of thinking about other historical phenomena. For example, gender relations, right? Histories of the body and sexuality, histories of production. So, for example, there is an explicit connection between textile production, fashion, and war, militarization, right? The kind of old term for dress history was hemline history, which had to do with how hemlines dropped or shortened depending on when, there was a war because textiles were needed. So in this way, one of the points that I make to students is that it's not that we interject fashion into the past, but that it is, or the history of clothing is fundamental to our understanding of the past.
So the next question is for you, Dr. Chen. So I don't know if you can see it from our new colleague, our new awesome colleague, Dr. Lapage. I was fascinated by your point about the transnational histories of the Sarasan and the Banyan. Could you elaborate on what kind of research methods and sources you use to trace these histories? So it's mostly drawing on material culture studies. And as Dr. Schwartz mentioned, material culture studies has long been a practice of kind of museum curators, right, of the exhibition space that only within the last few decades became incorporated into academia. And so there's like a wealth of material in museum archives that is not necessarily documented in traditional historical transmitted sources. So, the research method or the approach is really to try to integrate that kind of deep historical archival work with trying to make sense of the meanings, right? Like, how does one approach objects because they're not texts? We don't read objects necessarily. It's about trying to understand what kind of world making, perhaps, that these objects participated in. Thanks for that question. The next question from Ryan Snyder: how should we be thinking about the materials of fashion as primary sources? What are some of the promises or pitfalls? Maybe Dr. Louis, you sort of answered that, talking about how it seems immediate, but which can mask how strange or different it is. Maybe what are some other promises or pitfalls of using material culture or fashion as primary sources?
I suppose I see the promises and the pitfalls are kind of like the same thing in a way, because the very difficulty of studying like the fashion of the past, like questions of nomenclatures, or for instance, leads to like a questioning of what we take for granted, right? So what, some of the things that Dr. Chen was just explaining, how, the fashion in the past, for instance, requires us to rethink the way we conceptualize the relationship between bodies and textiles, for instance. Today we assume that there is a top and a bottom in clothes, but that was not the case. In the past, there was not even a difference between shoes and socks and trousers, right? It was just like one thing. So we, embracing like the diversity of in which various cultures like produce concepts that today we summarize as fashion, like help us to understand ourselves better, but also it forces us to ask kind of better questions, questions that is not just like a projections of our own anxieties and our emotions onto the past, but it's a way to keep in check our emotions and actually see what people were doing back then.
Thank you. Does it, Alex or BuYun, do you want to think about that question too, or should we move on to the?
Yeah, for me, it's not that different thinking about a dress or a suit is a primary source as thinking about a work of art. part of it depends on the context. Like, you can look at dress more as an artifact, and again, from that more anthropological perspective. But, any work of art is a testament to the time in which it was made and what people were thinking about, what the way they were expressing their cultural heritage or personal identity, or class, race. And fashion does the same thing. It just kind of is out there in the world in a slightly different way than a traditional work of art, which for me is part of what makes thinking about design in general so interesting, is that it is used. Like, it doesn't have the same preciousness that a traditional work of art does, that is on a wall or on a pedestal, that it actually is out there in the world being used every day, which I think almost makes it even more valuable as a historical document.
I guess I would say that, one of the challenges in working with visual and material sources also is the tendency of kind of an earlier generation of fashion historians to mine the pictorial or visual archive and see if there were changes, right? And if there were changes, then one could point to it and say, ha, I find fashion, right? There's a desire to change clothes. And as we've been talking about, that's actually that reliance on the visual record as almost photographic kind of misreads what those records are, or how those pictorial depictions are created. So I think, one of the challenges in working with visual and material artifacts is to really understand the context of their production, and that we can't assume that they were produced for us, and that we can, by looking at them and identifying a change in silhouette, know what was being represented.
That's great. Thank you. I mean, you just articulated something that, Emanuele has heard me talking about and trying to sort of recently to articulate like that. The next question, we got two more, and I think that'll be a good amount of time. It'll take us another 5 or so minutes to get through these awesome questions. Most of the exhibitions, this is from an anonymous attendee, in museums and in media press, highlights high-end, avant-garde, and highly artistic forms of fashion. To what extent does everyday fashion play a role in examining fashion history? Where does day-to-day wear fit into this conversation? I mean, if I can say one real quickly, I think, Alex, you and I talked about this, maybe the Fashioning Masculinity show, which I loved in London in a lot of ways. One of the things that it sort of, one of its limitations was sometimes these V&A shows can only look at sort of like high fashion, right? And had there been just sort of like everyday sorts of wear, jeans and stuff like that, it would have been a much more compelling discussion of masculinity and fashion in that show. But so maybe that's a museum thing. This question is about more than that, but it's certainly a phenomenon that the field is wrestling with. But where do you all want to reply?
I think it is. I mean, I think it's partly what has plagued fashion within a museum context or a historical context in general, is that, if you put just a pair of jeans up on a mannequin in a museum, people will say, why is that art? And so it's really difficult to make the same kind of argument about objects that aren't, quote unquote precious, or have that sort of monetary backing or that degree of craft or skill. I think that museums are often hesitant to take a risk on that kind of show because it is so controversial about whether it should be in a museum at all. But with that said, part of the reason I talked about the museum at FIT is that they really do that much more. I mean, a lot of what they show is couture or is by designers, but they're much more interested, and they're able, because of their funding structure, to do more kind of everyday fashion, as with the hip hop show or other exhibitions that they've done that are not just looking at the very high end, but trying to think about fashion and dress from like a broader perspective.
And I'm sure, you know, we might all say that outside of the museum, there's, in material culture studies, for instance, there's been a real turn towards, you know, to non-elite clothing, and technologies and modes of production of non-elite clothing. In my field, that it's happened very, very recently, but some of the most interesting stuff being produced now would follow that model to look beyond, you know, even in the past, looking at kind of like middle class or everyday wear for other classes as well. Dr. Chen or Dr. Lugli, do you want to add anything, or should we move to the?
I mean, if I can just add, I mean, I think it's been said, but maybe it's worth repeating. I mean, the museum as an institution, as a sort of like as treasuring what is considered most precious of produced by humankind, is you know, is exactly the reason why only certain pieces get bought, you know, displayed, and so on. So there are complex economic factors which kind of predetermine what is being displayed and therefore considered fashion.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so the last question, and then I'll thank everyone. Like performance, from my colleague Brian Seymour, like performance art that is difficult to celebrate in the form of a retrospective or a traditional museum format, is there a worry that the recreation of fashion and the rhetoric of the exhibitionary complex reperforms it while documenting it as history? Does anyone want to give that a shot?
I mean, since Dr. Schwartz showed it, I guess a recent example would be China Through the Looking Glass, which was an attempt by the Costume Institute to not dispense with Orientalism, but to try to rehabilitate it. Hence the title of the exhibition, Through the Looking Glass. And what it did, and as many scholars, fashion studies scholars have pointed out, was how, rather than rehabilitate Orientalism, if that's even possible, it only reinscribed it as the dominant or most kind of, what is the word I'm looking for? It's the most long-standing, perhaps, framework through which dress in China or Chinese design is only deemed relevant and interesting to a Western audience, right? So what it did was only fix the Western gaze rather than critique it or challenge it.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very resonant example.
I would just say that it's not just the museum, though, that risks doing that. I mean, books, but the designers themselves, right, reinscribe all these elements, and now especially that fashion is so well recorded through videos, you know, internet and so on. And so we have another sort of like uncontrollable kind of like repository of all these kind of informations, images, and so on. So even in how bloggers record clothes or so on, we have this kind of documents. So these questions have expanded beyond the museums, and they go right at the core of how, you know, for instance, fashion houses want to be remembered and so on. I mean, that's why fashion houses are investing so much money in trying to control the narratives and their aesthetics so thoroughly. And because they're like terrified that they may be presented and so on. I mean, we're worried about like historical documents. They're worrying about image and PR relations.
Thank you. Well, I think unless anyone has any final things they want to say, I might thank all of our three visitors today for this wonderful conversation. Paul or Dr. Rozier, am I supposed to do anything? Are you supposed to do anything to announce anything forthcoming, or do I just thank you? I'll quote Dr. Rozier for this stimulating set of presentations, and have a good night, and thank you for showing up, and thank you for participating, Dr. Schwartz and Chen and Lugli.